Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing a top 10. The topic of this top 10, top 10 scariest wrestlers. With this recording falling in the month of October, what most people call spooky season or pumpkin spice season, depending on who you are, there's a lot of scary content being let out. The Munsters remake, the newest Halloween movie, a bunch of different horror movies are coming out. All the streaming services have themed hubs that go with Halloween, so I figured I'd dip my hat into it, and this is my first of the scary content for the show. Now we're going to grade this by kayfabe scariness, real life scariness, and how they were portrayed. So basically, it's not going by who the most successful wrestler is, just by who the scariest is. With all that being said, let's jump right in. Number 10, the guy they call the Murder Grandpa, Minoru Suzuki. I would say you're probably not going to find a more intimidating figure in pro wrestling that's active right now, maybe Brock Lesnar, but Brock doesn't have that same aura that Suzuki does. The way that Suzuki attacks the young boys, the way he carries himself, the general insanity that he seems to have in his matches. To me, Suzuki's a guy that just strikes fear just by being himself. He doesn't have to have any special light shows. He doesn't have to have any special entrance. Matter of fact, his entrance music, one of the most fantastic entrance musics of all time. And matter of fact, it's one of the few wrestling songs that are on my Spotify playlist just because it's so awesome. But Suzuki is just a guy that goes out there, no nonsense, black shoes, black trunks, black towel around his head, kicks ass, takes names. And for that, he makes our list for being the 10th scariest wrestler of all time. Now going from that, our number 9, Kane. I've talked ad nauseum about how much I enjoy Kane and how I think he's a guy that's immensely talented, that took a 6-month character and got a 20-year career out of it. Kane always kind of is in the shadow of his brother, The Undertaker, and I feel like if there was no Undertaker, Kane would still be immensely successful. I mean, the guy was intimidating. He was absolutely frightening. There's a 7-foot monster that can move around like the guys that are 200 pounds and has the psychology down. And all the stuff between his horror movie, with the mask, without the mask, yeah, there was some hokiness to it, but there was a damn lot of his career where Kane was just the scariest figure in wrestling. He came out dominating matches. People feared him. He threw Zack Ryder off of the stage in a wheelchair. Just a menacing guy. Definitely, in my opinion, one of the scariest wrestlers of all time. Now, our number 8. 2 of the faces of Foley, Cactus Jack and Mankind. And we're talking about early Mankind, pre-corporate Mankind, Boiler Room Mankind with the brown outfit we're talking about. And Cactus Jack pre-WWE. Cactus was scary, much like Suzuki, because he was unhinged. You didn't know what Cactus Jack was going to do. You didn't know if he was going to hit you with a bat. You didn't know if he was going to hit himself with a bat. You didn't know if he was going to set you on fire, set himself on fire. You didn't know if he was going to jump off of a building just to drop an axe handle on you. The guy, there's not a lot that you could say about Mick Foley that hasn't already been said. He's an absolute legend in the business. The lengths that he took and where he took his body to and how much he gave up to create the Cactus Jack character and the Mankind character and even the Dude Love character to an extent. The lengths he would take to make you believe how dangerous he was and how scary he was really made everybody buy in. To me, he's my absolute favorite wrestler of all time. The reason I would say he's not further up on this list, because even in his scariest moments, there was still a likability, a lovability that came through because of Mick Foley the person, such a great human being, that just carried through everything he did. So there was always that wink wink, nod nod, I'm really a great guy, even though I'm stabbing The Undertaker in the head with a chair, or whatever he was doing at the time. And I know you can't stab people with a chair, but anyway, I digress. That's why Cactus, aka Mankind, makes a list. Now our number 7, Bray Wyatt. And his career's seen a lot of changes right now. He just came back at the time of this recording with the White Rabbit stuff, which I think has all been fantastic. To me, his scariest moments when he was the cult leader, the backwoods guy, the Waylon Mercy inspired, the Cape Fear inspired character. And not that The Fiend was bad, there were some really hokey parts of The Fiend, and I liked that he tried and he went there. I think the Firefly Funhouse was fantastic at times. At times it went a little bit over the edge, most famously the Hell in a Cell match, and burning to a crisp. I mean, there was some things that he was a little bit out there on, but he was willing to try. And to me, he was at his absolute scariest when he was just a guy that people listened to, that he controlled. He controlled Luke Harper and Eric Rowan and eventually Braun Strowman, and had these monsters that were willing to do whatever he said. And shout out to Luke Harper, rest in peace Brody Lee, what an awesome wrestler. But with that being said, I mean, to me, the psychological aspect of the Bray Wyatt character was always the scariest part of it. Even though he would go on and evolve it and become more supernatural, and yes, that's still scary, and I'm sure there's kids that are watching the show that think that he's the scariest guy they've ever seen. So for that, Bray makes our list. Our number 6, a guy that I guarantee Bray Wyatt took a lot of cues from, Jake the Snake Roberts. Jake was so different for his time. When everybody was yelling and screaming, Jake was whispering. When everybody was trying to evolve and have these crazy matches, Jake slowed it down. Jake would bring either a python or a cobra out to the ring, which added to his aura. You always felt like there was a chance, even when Jake was a babyface, that he was going to do something and turn on his opponent. Famously, he turns on the Warrior. Jake, just everything about him, the psychology of his matches, I would say is pretty much unmatched in wrestling. There's a couple guys, one of them we're going to talk about here in a moment. The other being Raven, who I think their psychology is right up there with the best that's ever done it. And Jake is that guy. Jake could talk in a promo and make you believe some of the most absurd things he ever said. There's a reason why, after all the mess-ups, we still gave Jake a chance, because he was just that compelling. Everybody wanted to see him. I mean, if you only know Jake Roberts for being the AEW manager or post the DDP thing, the resurrection of Jake Roberts, if you didn't watch him back in the day, even back in his Mid-South days, which he was fantastic in Mid-South, you don't really know how great Jake Roberts was. And there's a reason why a lot of people, when they're asked who's one of their favorite wrestlers, they'll say Jake the Snake Roberts. Jake never won a major championship, yet he was one of the most influential wrestlers of his generation. Now, coming from Jake, a contemporary of his, our number 5, Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan, much like the Bray Wyatt character, Bray took a lot of cues from Kevin as well. Even Kevin Sullivan even had Jake in his Army of Darkness at one point, Jake the Snake. To me, the stuff he did in Florida, and not so much the Dungeon of Doom. Dungeon of Doom was a little bit more campy, where, let's say Jake the Snake Roberts, let's say Kevin Sullivan in Florida was the original Halloween movie. The Dungeon of Doom is like when we get to the 6th or 7th sequel, when you're like, okay, what are you going to do with this guy? Or like, a better example, when they put Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th in space. Okay, you put this absolutely terrifying character in this goofy movie. Kevin Sullivan in Florida was so intimidating and so scary, and here's this guy that's smaller than most of the wrestlers he's wrestling with, but the way he talked, and he never said that he was Satan. Everybody else did. He was quoting Buddha. He was quoting different religions. He never professed to be a Satanist. Fans absolutely wanted to murder him. I believe there's stories going around where there was a guy that famously waited outside to try and kill Kevin Sullivan because he thought he was the devil. Everything he did with the purple haze, with the angel Nancy Sullivan, all his stuff with Mark Lewin, with Bob Roop, all of that is so fantastic. And if you haven't seen it, there's some of it has got out there. Go check it. Go look for Kevin Sullivan in Florida. It is some of the most fascinating stories that wrestling's ever told. His ongoing feud with Dusty Rhodes made Dusty Rhodes what he eventually would be, which was one of the biggest stars in wrestling, in my opinion. Now, coming from Kevin Sullivan, our number 4, Abdullah the Butcher. You knew that Abby would make this list. I mean, how can you not put a guy that for basically 30 years terrorized wrestling with a fork and, again, just an unhinged style? People had no clue what he was going to do. You were just as easily going to see Abdullah the Butcher wrestle through the crowd than you would see Abdullah the Butcher wrestle in the ring. And the fork was coming out. No matter what, the fork was coming out. And Abby would bleed too. Abby, if you look at his forehead, I mean, it looks like you could stick quarters in between the scarring. He was a guy that when I first started watching wrestling, you would see Abdullah the Butcher come out and it would just scare the crap out of me. And granted, yes, I was a young kid. But that always stuck with me, and it still sticks with me. He still has that aura. If I watch an Abdullah the Butcher match now, and don't get me wrong, there are some where he got to the hokey points. Again, later on in WCW, the Chamber of Horror matches where he gets electrocuted. But it's just, there's such an aura about him and such a general unhingedness of what he was doing that made you believe that this guy is an absolute murderer. He can kill anybody at any point, and there's very little we could do to stop him. And that's why I think Abdullah makes the list, for his longevity and for how believable he was. Now, coming from that, our number 3, probably the most believable in real life as being scary, Haku, aka Ming. This is a lot more to do with the outside of the ring than it does with the inside. And don't get me wrong, inside of the ring, before I even heard stories about Haku and Ming, when I just was watching wrestling and had no clue about any of the backstage stuff, Haku was scary. I loved watching Haku matches because he looked legit. And I always was drawn to the wrestlers that looked like they were really fighting. You felt like it was a real fight with Haku, and I'm not knocking anybody's work, but at the time there's a huge difference between what Hulk Hogan's doing and what Haku is doing. There's a huge difference between what a lot of the wrestlers, the big steroided wrestlers who look like they're tough because of how big they are, and a guy that's legitimately tough and carries himself as such, like Haku. And I'm going to alternate between the two. I would probably say his scariest point in his career is his WCW run, like as a scary character when he was part of the Faces of Fear. But the guy, the stories are legendary. If you ask anybody that's ever been in the wrestling business who the toughest guy in wrestling is, 999,999 out of 1 million are going to say Haku. You may have one person that says somebody different, but even then, it'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that doesn't think that he's an absolute monster, an absolute scary human being. And from what I understand, I've never had the chance of personally meeting him, he's one of the nicest guys in the world that you can meet. So that's absolutely awesome to hear. For that reason, Haku gets on the list. Now, coming from that, our number 2, probably one of the scariest wrestlers of all time, kayfabe-wise, The Undertaker. Again, there were some people you knew were going to be on this list. And yes, there were times when The Undertaker got goofy, where there were 2 Undertakers, where he ascended to heaven. There were times when it crossed the line. But for the most part, the Ministry of Darkness era, that stuff was a lot like what Kevin Sullivan did. His initial aura coming in as the undead zombie that could not be beat. His stuff in the Boiler Room with Mankind, aka Mick Foley. His Hell in a Cell match with Foley. You believe The Undertaker, and he was one of the weirdest gimmicks and the craziest gimmicks that's ever existed, and people believed in him. If there was anybody else that did this, they'd crap all over it. The Undertaker was the only guy that could pull off that gimmick and absolutely frighten people. And from when little kids would watch a show, from very young ages like myself, I want to say I was 12 or 13 when he debuted. I get the year wrong all the time because they're always putting up Undertaker's such and such anniversary. But when he debuted the Undertaker character, I was still kind of young, and it was like, whoa, that's different. Okay, that's scary. And then, imagine a generation, 30 years of kids feeling that way. Absolutely one of the biggest legends in the history of wrestling, one of the scariest wrestlers that's ever did it. Now, before we get into our number 1, We do a thing here on our top 10s called the best of the rest. Basically, these were guys that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it for whatever reason. First up, the Monster Abyss. Abyss, to me, before I really paid attention to what he was doing, I felt like he was a Mick Foley clone, like a Mankind clone. And there's an argument to be said about that. The mask is very similar, the gear is very similar, the style is very similar. However, Abyss went to carve on his own lane. Yeah, there were similarities. Of course there were. And he was probably influenced by Mick. And it was probably their way of honoring the guy. Abyss, to me, is one of those guys that are synonymous with TNA. Him, AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, Kurt Angle. These guys are what were the groundwork and the foundation that made TNA. And TNA was special for a time. I mean, it's gone up and down. There have been all kinds of highs and lows through the company. But a lot of the highs involve guys like Abyss in the Monsters Ball matches, his pairing with Father James Mitchell, his matches with basically anybody. Him and AJ had some fantastic matches. And for being a character which a lot of people wrote off as a ripoff of Mick Foley, he really carved his own lane. And it's amazing to see just how far the guy went and how far he took it. I absolutely love Abyss. Now, next up on our best of the rest, another guy that's probably scarier in real life, New Jack. You can't have a list talking about a Scariest Wrestlers without a guy who's legitimately tried to throw somebody 30 feet to their death, stabbed a wrestler in the ring, beat an 80-year-old man in the head with a baseball bat in a match, and that's not even talking about the mass transit incident, where he bladed a kid that almost died from blood loss. Say what you will about New Jack, almost called him Cactus Jack. Say what you will about New Jack, but there was an aura there. He was dangerous. He was, to quote Paul Heyman said on Talking Smack, and it resonates with me so much. The weekend that New Jack passed away, he was on Talking Smack, and he said that, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm probably getting the exact quote wrong. In a company that was full of gangsters, New Jack was the most gangsta. And there's nothing that you can't say about that. He scared you in a way that a guy that's going to rob you would scare you. He scared you in a way that a guy that's kicking in your back door and going to do a home invasion would scare you. I mean, the guy was absolutely terrifying, even to his opponents at times. For that reason, he was considered, unfortunately didn't quite make the list. Last but not least, on our best of the rest, Ox Baker. If you look up a face of a villain and you wanted to make an AI version of it, Ox Baker would probably be that. Just his face alone scared the crap out of people. Let alone the fact that he had the fabled heart punch, which could kill a person. Ox was just a terrifying madman. And again, a lot like some of the other people we talked about, Kevin Sullivan, Abdullah The Butcher, some of his best work wasn't recorded, so you don't get to see Ox Baker in his prime. You get to see him a little bit later on, and even later on in his career, he's an absolute menace. I mean, the guy was like 6'8", 6'9", and just destroyed everybody. I loved him in Escape from New York. I mean, I thought he was awesome just being in the middle of the movie. Here's Ox Baker showing up. Wow, how great was that? And that was before wrestlers were in a ton of movies. Just a fantastic guy. Another guy, again, who has a perfect face to be a heel, hence why he was considered, but didn't quite make the list. Now, before I get to my number one, if you think I left somebody off, put somebody too high, put somebody too low, let me know in the comments. Make sure you subscribe, like, share, all that good stuff. With all that being said, our number one scariest professional wrestler of all time, Bruiser Brody. Brody, much like Abdullah The Butcher, much like Kevin Sullivan, much like all the guys on this list, he had an absolute aura about him. He was a madman. He would swing a chain around and clear out rows of fans at a time. He would do absolutely anything. Much like Abdullah The Butcher, one of his great rivalries, you were just as likely to see Bruiser Brody fighting in the concession stand as you were in the ring. When you got him in matches, famously like his cage match against Lex Luger, Luger was so scared that he ran out of the cage mid-match and just left because he didn't know what Bruiser Brody was going to do. And that was part of the aura. You didn't know what was going to happen when Bruiser Brody showed up. Were you going to get hit with a chair? Were you going to get booted in the face? Was he going to stab somebody with with a knife or a fork? Was he going to use a chain on you? Bruiser Brody was an absolute menace, an absolute destroyer. I can't say enough about how great Bruiser Brody was. He's one of the guys that, again, his work isn't seen much in America. And I know a lot of his Japanese work you could probably go out there and find if you really want to, where he was his absolute best. And just look at the way the crowds in Japan treat Bruiser Brody. Look at the way the crowds in Texas treated Bruiser Brody when he wrestled for World Class. Look at the way they treat him in AWA. Anywhere he went, he was treated like some guy that just got let out of an insane asylum and was going to destroy everything in his path. For that reason and his tremendous influence on wrestling, Bruiser Brody to me is the scariest wrestler of all time. Again, let me know what you think. If I left someone off, put someone too high, someone too low, hit me down here in the comments. And if you made it all the way to the end, let's put your favorite scary movie down in the comments. If I haven't seen one, maybe it'll give me something to watch during this spooky season. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been my top 10 scariest wrestlers of all time.